Since I started doing this YouTube thing, I have had the suggestion put to me from time to time by several people that I should do something on the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab and Davos and that whole thing. I still haven't done it, not because I didn't want to, but because I just found it kind of a tough nut to crack. I didn't have any unique angle on the subject that was different than the way most of you probably see it, that the WEF is, to all intents and purposes, a group of very affluent people who seek to position themselves as a sort of de facto world government, which is a conclusion that can be safely arrived at without much in the way of deep analysis, or deep analysis, as Mr. Plinkett would say. I'm also highly attuned to the fact that there are those of you in the audience, and you know who you are, who think I am a bit of a weirdo for knowing too much about the history of European royalty. That criticism usually goes something like, oh, come on, man, we're supposed to be Americans here. We're not supposed to go in for all that royalty shit. What possible good could all that arcane knowledge be doing you? Well, tonight in this opening segment, like two drunk drivers colliding in the dead of night, we are going to visit the intersection between those two things. And I bet you didn't know there was such an intersection, did you? I sure didn't. Not until last week when I received the suggestion again and decided, okay, it's time. I need to find an angle on this thing and just go with it. Now, we know about the big names that attend Davos, that big shindig each year, your American grifter celebrities and grifter politicians, but as far as the actual members of the WEF go, aside from Klaus Schwab himself, shut up and eat the bugs! We must eat the bugs to save the planet from the changing climate. The bugs are very tasty. Shut up and eat them! Most people, myself included, have never given all that much thought to their identities. They're just some amorphous blob of super wealthy Euro douchebags, right? But then I had quite the epiphany when I started studying the actual list of names. Before 1 minute had elapsed, the proverbial light bulb went off in my head, and I had my eureka moment. Holy shit, I said. 80% of these people are from the former royal houses of Europe, and 90% of that 80% is German. So how does that come to pass, you ask? Well, here's where we need to get into some historical background. Everybody knows that the First World War was effectively the death knell for most of the royal dynasties of continental Europe. The Kaiser got deposed, the Austrian Emperor got deposed, the Tsar got shot, and so on. But here's the thing about the German part of that equation. The Hohenzollerns, the house of the Kaiser Wilhelms, they were not Germany's only royal house, and not by a long shot. There were actually 20 others tied together in a confederation with the King of Prussia, Kaiser Wilhelm, as its head. If you don't believe me, here they are in descending order of precedence. You got 4 kingdoms: Prussia, Bavaria, Saxony, Württemberg. 6 grand duchies: Baden, Hesse and by Rhine, Mecklenburg-Schwerin, Mecklenburg-Strelitz, Oldenburg, and Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach. 5 regular duchies: Anhalt, Brunswick, Saxe-Altenburg, Saxe-Meiningen, and Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. And if that last one sounds familiar, that's because it became the British royal house when Prince Albert married Queen Victoria, which it remained up until 1917 when they changed the name to Windsor because King George V decided it wasn't the best look having a German last name when you're in the middle of fighting a war against the Germans. And finally, you've got 6 principalities. And yes, it is a strange quirk of the German noble system that a duke outranks a prince, but then the Germans are a strange people. Lippe, Reuss-Greiz, Reuss-Gera, Schaumburg-Lippe, Schwarzburg, Rudolstadt, and Waldeck-Pyrmont. And this opening segment is getting away from me, so go grab yourself a strudel and some sauerkraut, strap on your trusty lederhosen, and meet me back here in 5 seconds, ja? Hoch oben auf den Zinnen von Schloss Kermödden. Guten Abend, Herr und Frau Amerika und alle Schiffe auf See. Willkommen zum Programm. Ich bin eigentlich ein mager Gastgeber und besten Verdiener. So when the Versailles Treaty gets ratified and the Weimar Republic gets declared, the German royals, all 20 families worth of them, they lose their royal status. And it's not just the royal families either, the crowned heads, if you will, because subordinate to your kings and your grand dukes and your princes, you've got a whole constellation of people in the lesser nobility, your counts and your barons and your margraves and your landgraves and so on. Some of the noble houses managed to do pretty well for themselves, provided they were based in the western part of the country and didn't get too caught up in Nazi Party politics before and during the Second World War. But the ones in Eastern Germany, who were committed National Socialists, many of them wound up meeting their end looking down the barrel of a Russian gun, or worse. The ones who made it to the end of the war and managed to get themselves on fairly good terms with the Americans and the British, they got out of it for the most part with their lands and fortunes intact. Many of them went on to have leading positions in the military and government of West Germany during the period when West Germany was a thing. But let's face it, when you go from being a prince or a grand duke to being just another private citizen who happens to own a castle or two, well, you've been significantly diminished in power and prestige compared to what you used to enjoy. And people tend to not take such things very well. When you're accustomed to a certain level of power and prestige and you lose it, the natural reaction is not to say, oh well, them's the breaks, we had a good run. No, the natural reaction is to say, God damn it, we have to get our power and prestige back. If not by getting restored to royal status, then by whatever other means are available to us. And so, behold the World Economic Forum, under the leadership of the Prussian aristocrat Herr Schwab. Shut up and eat the bugs! They are very healthy. You will own nothing, and you will like it, and you will eat the bugs. But you may find yourself wondering, hold on, Cap? If these people are mostly the remnant of the former German royal and princely houses, shouldn't we expect them to be more conservative in their political orientation, and not a bunch of wild-eyed woke leftist maniacs? The answer is no, we should not, and here's why. Because the climate change religion gives them exactly the opening they want and need in order to recoup the power and prestige they used to enjoy and desperately want to get back. Because the whole premise of the climate change religion is that we have to take global action to save ourselves from all burning to death in a blazing inferno of suffering and despair, or to save ourselves from being drowned by the rising oceans. Take your pick, I guess. The point being, it's a religion whose doctrines and scriptures predicate themselves on the idea that somebody has to go over the heads of the elected national governments and dictate policy on a global basis. And wouldn't that be a great job for us as the former German aristocrats? It's a perfect angle for undermining national sovereignty and thus returning themselves to the same level of power and prestige that their great-great-grandparents used to enjoy. And it ain't just climate change either. The Davos crowd, we know they were fully 100% on board with all of the backward, draconian, brute force public health tyranny that we've seen since the emergence of the great communist Chinese Wuhan Kung Flu coronavirus of 2019, brought to you by Dr. Anthony Fauci. Allegedly. But not really allegedly, because it's kind of all a matter of public record. Moving on, and speaking of the Chi-Coms, if you're a person who gets your information about the world from the mainstream corporate fake news media, you may be shocked to learn that China is currently experiencing its most widespread social unrest since Tiananmen Square 33 and a half years ago. But if you turn on one of the big cable news channels, you are not going to hear one word about it. You'll get wall-to-wall coverage of who Donald Trump eats dinner with. Wall-to-wall coverage of Elon Musk destroying democracy by letting people freely express themselves on the internet. But a widespread civil insurrection in the world's most populous country? Well, that's a complete non-event so far as they, the professional journalists, are concerned. Not even worthy of a passing mention. And doesn't that seem a bit strange? Because if we take a trip in the time-traveling DeLorean of our minds back to the summer of 1989, the Tiananmen Square protests, they were not 48 hours old before every TV network, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, all of them, was broadcasting live directly from the scene 24 hours a day. And as it stands to reason, they should have, because it was the biggest news story of 1989. Indeed, it was one of the biggest news stories of the entire decade. The only reason to not cover it would have been out of some bizarre desire to carry water for the Chinese Communist Party. And the same principle holds true today. Our news organizations are refusing to cover the story, and the only possible explanation for it is that they don't want to make the Chi-Coms look bad. But we can't talk about the events of 1989, not even obliquely, without talking about the weakness and effectlessness and moral cowardice of President George Bush the Elder, who, when Chinese communism was teetering on the brink of being swept into the dustbin of history where it damn well belongs, when the world needed decisive moral leadership from the U.S. president, when the protesters in the streets needed some signal of open support to embolden them and help them finish the job and take back their country, he flatly refused to give it. And the ramifications of that failure, they have been more numerous and more terrible than we ever could have envisaged at the time. Bush and his administration, in the aftermath of Tiananmen Square, it was clear they realized the severity of their blunder because they spent the next 2 years trying to cobble together some sort of alternate solution where they could magically transform China into a Western-style liberal democracy and thus be off the hook for being a bunch of cowardly fools. So by 1991, China is allowed to join the World Trade Organization. The Western powers remove all of their trade restrictions and the ball starts slowly rolling down the hill. The idea, as it was explained to us by the Republicans and Democrats of the time, both alike, was that if we fully normalize trade and diplomatic relations with China, then once they get a taste of that sweet, delicious capitalism, everything else will take care of itself, and a free and democratic China will magically emerge like a butterfly from the cocoon. And since it's been a little over 30 years now, I think it's only prudent that we take stock of how that's all working out. I mean, it can't be a failed experiment, right? If it was a failed experiment, surely we wouldn't still be doing it after 3 full decades of no favorable results for our side. But oh boy, it sure has been great for the Chi-Coms, hasn't it? We've allowed them to siphon off vast sectors of our own economy to help themselves to all the intellectual property and military secrets they can get their grubby little hands on. And who even knows how many of our elected officials in Congress are compromised by the Chinese intelligence services? You think Eric Swalwell and Dianne Feinstein and cocaine Mitch McConnell are the only 3? Yeah, me either. And not just the elected officials. Just last year, we were treated to the bizarre spectacle of the chairman of the Joint freaking Chiefs of Staff testifying before Congress that if he received an order to launch an attack, he would have placed a courtesy call to his Chinese counterparts, his good buddies, to give them a heads up. You see, I am old enough to remember when it was a bedrock cornerstone foundation of U.S. policy that we do not ever engage in normalized diplomatic and trade relations with any communist country. Why? Because they're fucking communist, and communism is fucking evil, and we don't deal with evil people. That used to be reason enough. And it was reason enough. It was a sensible, pragmatic policy that best safeguarded our own interests. And then all of a sudden, one day in 90 or 91, it was just gone. And I'm hard-pressed to think of any prominent conservative at the time, except Pat Buchanan, who seemed cognizant of what the pitfalls were in taking this approach and how disastrous the unintended results could potentially be. And those results we can see all around us in the present day. The only other guy I remember ringing the alarm bell was Donald Trump. He was right about it too. And in fact, he was right on just about everything that he warned against during that period, and I don't think he gets enough credit for it. But seriously, if you've got some time to kill during the holidays, sit down and watch one of Trump's C-SPAN interviews from the early 90s. You will hear a man who sounds pretty close to a clairvoyant. Every single bad thing that he predicted would result from the diplomatic blunders of that time frame has come to pass. So take that for what you will when you're deciding whom you want the next president to be. I mean, that is, if you want your vote to be based on real things that actually matter, or you can just vote based on feelings and emotions. Take your pick, I guess. And look, it would be bad enough if the worst actors in this sordid drama were the news networks for refusing to cover the China protests. But it seems Apple is working pretty hand in glove with the Chi-Coms to confound the protesters, to prevent them from being able to communicate with one another, and to disseminate their words and their views to the outside world. Facebook, same deal. Google, same deal. All the usual suspects, really. All the U.S. companies that happily censor and slander Americans, who speak of the United States as if it's some backward evil hellhole, but would never in a million billion years say one unkind word about the CCP. Oh, hi Nike. Hi NBA. Yes, you guys do belong in that group. Thanks for asking. Because nothing says I love freedom and democracy like denigrating this country and its people while at the same time attempting to sell them apparel that was made by 8-year-old Chinese child slaves. But please, tell me more about systemic racism, Daddy. Tell me more about transgender equity. Your moral posturing comes from such a place of unimpeachable credibility. Tell me more about what an awful person I am when I am not the one who chains small children to a sewing machine for 26 hours a day. And before we close tonight, I guess this is one of those cases where I can be fairly criticized for plucking the low-hanging fruit. But damn it, I just can't let this this Alyssa Milano thing pass without comment. You may remember Alyssa Milano as the angry angel of death who was glowering over the shoulder of the nominee during the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearings. Because if that doesn't say we are all living in a totally non-serious clown world, I have no idea what does. But these days, she is failing spectacularly at being a social media virtue signaler. You see, Elon Musk bought Twitter, as you may have heard. And now Elon Musk says he is going to throw out all the dumbass censorship rules and reinstate all the accounts that have been banned for no good reason. And that is bad. That is very, very bad. That is existential threat to our sacred democracy bad. It's basically one of the worst things ever. A social media platform where people can say things that might potentially hurt the feelings of dumb, fragile leftists, that's a thing that cannot be tolerated. So Alyssa Milano, she needed to find some way of getting back at Elon Musk for his reckless attempt to rip asunder the very fabric of our society itself. And she comes up with the bright idea of swapping out her Tesla for a Volkswagen. Which, okay, whatever. It's a free country. More power to you. Except she couldn't leave it at that. She had to include a public act of virtue signaling so she could soak up the plaudits and the adulation of her many, many fans who would surely line up to praise her for her obvious moral righteousness. So she announces, on Twitter, naturally, that Elon Musk, he stands for racism and white supremacy, so I've gotten rid of my Tesla and replaced it with a Volkswagen. At this point, she probably assumed it would be a simple matter of just checking back in a couple hours to see how many thousands and thousands of upvotes and fawningly positive comments she had telling her what an awesomely principled person she is. Except, whoopsie, that's not quite the way it worked out, because when she checked back in a couple hours, all she saw was people laughing at her for being such an impossible dumbass that she didn't know Volkswagen, the car she drives because she wants to give the big middle finger to white supremacy, was invented by Adolf Hitler himself. And I guess in some roundabout way, I have managed to bring the episode full circle right back to the Germans. It is so elegant, I'm just going to pretend I did it on purpose. Thank you very much indeed for watching. See you Friday. If anybody has any great suggestions for episode number 300, don't be shy. Let me hear it. Until then, have a pleasant tomorrow. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.